Last week, we looked at the general conditions that allow muckraking to flourish. We looked at all those questions of how come sometimes countries and people pay attention to the stories and it changes everything and it affects society and people sit up and take notice, and sometimes they really don't. And we looked at the conditions that are necessary for that to take place. You know, what does it take for journalism, global muckraking, to really have an impact? And what we're going to be doing this week is we're going to drill down. We're going to look at a really hard story that global muckrakers have often tackled, often at great danger to themselves, which is that whole question of oil, gas, and mining. How do you cover that? It's an incredibly important story because those companies are huge. They make alliances with governments in many poor places of the world, and it can often take a really, really long time for journalists to figure out how to write about them. You remember that with E.D. Morel and King Leopold and the stories that Henry Wood Nevinson did about the Cadburys? Those were such important stories, and they wrote about them for years, and they did a huge amount of research. But it still took years and years and years before society sat up and took notice. Well, I like to think of E.D. Morel as kind of the grandfather of the African journalists who are today writing about the extractive sector. They're writing about extraction. Rubber was extraction, and oil, gas, and mining are extraction. But the difference is that today, these companies that do that oil, gas, and mining have enormous power. And very often, the countries where they work, things start to go horribly, horribly wrong. There's environmental damage, corruption, war, people get moved around. The results on society of extraction are actually very, very difficult. And small, countries that don't have a lot of funding often really end up having a very, very hard time. So you can see that there's this sort of huge, huge role for journalists to play. We really need the global muckraking about the extractive sector. And the good news is that thanks to digital technology, there's a lot of new tools now that can actually help journalists who are writing about these subjects. So we'll be talking about that this week as well. Nigerian journalist Omoyele Sowore is going to tell us about the website he started, Sahara Reporters, that focuses on oil in Nigeria and also about the terrible corruption there. We're also going to be hearing from the Dean of Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism. His name is Steve Cole. He's won Pulitzer Prizes, and he's written the definitive book on Exxon, the oil company. He's going to be talking to us about how sometimes foreign journalists working overseas can get stories that journalists in country can't get, and how that can help journalists really in both places. Extracting natural resources makes a lot of money for big companies, and the world pays for those resources, especially, of course, in the last few years, China. So a country that has a lot of oil or has a lot of mines is going to get an enormous inflow of money. In an ideal world, the government is well run and it's honest and it uses the money widely. It starts spending money on education and schools, it brings down inequality, it builds roads, it builds infrastructure. But the reality is that doesn't often happen. So we often say that these countries that have a lot of mining or they have a lot of oil, they have a lot of gas, we call it the resource curse or the paradox of plenty, all the big problems that they can often wind up with. Global muckrakers play a vital role in covering the extractive sector. They can do investigations into corporate abuse, corporate malfeasance, environmental devastation, corruption, and in some places it's the journalist that may be all that stands between vulnerable populations and the breakdown of their now fragile societies. Journalists like Rafael Marquez from Angola, Carlos Cardozo from Mozambique, or even the writer and activist Ken Saro-Wiwa have all written about the extractives. The good news is that even journalism that's written outside the country can be very, very powerful inside a country. In 2003, American reporter Ken Silverstein from the Los Angeles Times wrote about oil money from Equatorial Guinea. Well, it turned out $300 million of this money were stashed in a Riggs Bank in Washington, D.C. He pointed out that while the president and government officials had benefited from the money, many of the population were just living on $1 a day. It was a glaring example of the resource curse. Silverstein's Los Angeles Times story had a domino effect that ultimately led to law enforcement investigations in 5 countries, a U.S. Senate inquiry, and a French arrest warrant against a vice president of Equatorial Guinea. it was a startling example of great journalism on the extractives. But when we think about what global muckrakers can do, let's remember something. Silverstein had the support of a well-funded, well-established, and prestigious U.S. newspaper. What happens to the global muckrakers or the aspiring global muckrakers in poor parts of, say, Africa? What happens when they hit the hard wall of multinational corporations and the regimes that embrace them? This week, we're going to talk about the difficulties of covering oil, gas, and mining in Africa, and we're going to look at some of the success stories too.